Recently, I came across an interesting piece titled, "You Don't Really Know Who Bernie Sanders Was in the 1960s, Why It Mattered Then and Why It Matters in 2018." Now, obviously, it isn't 2018 anymore, but I still found this piece to be quite fascinating and enlightening. And this is a piece that examines Bernie Sanders in terms of his activism, specifically his activism in regards to civil rights. More specifically, the author of this piece wrote that he rejects this idea that who Bernie Sanders was in the 1960s is irrelevant. Who you are and what you do, what you fought for, and who and what you fought against is always relevant. Dr. King once said, "The ultimate measure of a man is not where he stands in moments of comfort and convenience, but where he stands at times of challenge and controversy." Bernie loved Dr. King, and long before we used the phrase, Bernie had the notion that he needed to use his own white privilege to fight back against racism and bigotry and oppression and inequality. And that desire to hold this country to a higher standard began to well up in Bernie as a young student at the University of Chicago. He became the chairman of the university chapter of the Congress for Racial Equality and merged the group with SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Bernie literally helped lead the first known sit-in at the University of Chicago, where 33 students camped outside of the president's office, protesting segregating housing on campus. Now, I don't know what you guys think, but to me, this is highly impressive. To lead a protest against segregation at a time when it was obviously not the politically or socially convenient thing to do exemplifies an enormous amount of courage and character on Bernie's part. I mean, Bernie's white. His rights weren't being infringed upon. He didn't have to do this, and yet he did anyway, which I think says a lot about Bernie's character at the time. Disturbed by police brutality in Chicago, Bernie once spent the entire day blanketing the city with flyers on the issue, only to notice that he was being tracked by police who were following him and taking the flyers down. Bernie hates telling these stories and has resisted using them for political capital across the years. Even when advisors and others have told him it would boost his profile, he has refused. He does what he does because he cares. When I introduced Bernie at a rally in Los Angeles by sharing many of these stories, his own family came to me in tears saying that even they had never heard them before. He always felt that what he did during the 60s paled in comparison to those who were beaten or lost their lives, and so he has kept some powerful stories to himself. It's cool for people to say, "I marched with Dr. King," and Bernie actually did attend the March on Washington, but he did so much more than that. This is not some exaggerated myth. This is the origin story of a political revolutionary. And yes, before we move on, you heard right. Bernie attended the March on Washington, the Dr. King March on Washington. In 1963, 9 years after Brown versus the Board of Education, the white power structure in Chicago was still fighting against school equality like their lives depended on it. They literally treated black school children like they had the plague. Not only were black schools woefully underfunded, they were overcrowded and bursting at the seams. At the same time, with every single black classroom in Chicago past capacity, sometimes with school children sharing chairs and desks, a report found that 382 white classrooms across Chicago were completely vacant. Mayor Richard Daley, who ruled Chicago with an iron fist, still hailed as a Democratic hero to this day, and school superintendent Benjamin Willis decided that before they would let a single black child fill one of those vacant white classrooms, they would start putting raggedy trailers on the playgrounds and in the parking lots of black schools and put black school kids in those trailers instead. They were scorching hot in the summer and bitterly cold in the winter. They were so cheap and poorly constructed that they often had holes in the floor, allowing rodents to come in and out at will. And those awful trailers became known around Chicago as Willis Wagons, named after Benjamin Willis, the school superintendent. In August of 1963, just days before the March on Washington, the city of Chicago was about to install some more Willis Wagons for black school children, and a brave, interracial group of local activists and organizers decided to put their bodies on the line to block the installation of those trailers. They stood in front of the bulldozers. They chained themselves together. Out of his reverence for what activists in the South were doing, Bernie has long since downplayed this demonstration, but it took so much courage. Bernie, side by side with black women, chained to them, refused to move. Even when the Chicago police told him they would arrest him and forcefully remove him, he refused. And even when they decided to arrest Bernie and pick him up and carry him out of that parking lot so they could instill those Willis wagons, he kicked and screamed and resisted the entire way. Have you seen that photo of them carrying Bernie? I love it. And that photo to me is not just who Bernie was. It's who he's been his entire life. To say that all of that means nothing is fundamentally preposterous. It means everything. Bernie was a protester. Bernie was an activist. Bernie was an organizer. And he is literally the only person in the United States Senate with this story. When he retires, he will be the last activist from the civil rights era in the United States Senate. He did much more than this. I could tell you a dozen more stories, but I wanted to tell you who Bernie was when it counted. Before we knew him, before he ever ran for office, before he was ever a national figure, he was a fighter. I don't know about you guys, but to me, this is quite the impressive story. Talk about courage. Think about it. To take the side of the oppressed, to take the side of people who are being bigoted against when bigotry often entails an intense hatred. That seems so dangerous. Anytime hatred is involved, bad things can really happen. By chaining himself to that black woman, by attempting to block the installation of those Willis wagons, by refusing to move after being threatened to be arrested and forcefully removed, by resisting and kicking and screaming while being arrested and being removed, Bernie was taking a big risk. He was not only risking social harm to himself, but also, in a worst-case scenario, Bernie was risking physical harm to himself. Again, Bernie didn't have to do this. Bernie's white. His rights weren't being infringed upon. But he did anyway. He stood up for what was right at a time when it was not easy to do so. Now that's the sign of a true leader. Sometimes I think we as a people really underappreciate Bernie Sanders and what he represents. Sadly, a lot of our politicians in Washington are not genuine. They are not genuinely there to represent and fight for the rights and well-being of the American people. But Bernie Sanders is one of the few politicians out there who actually is. And he isn't just fighting for the American people now. As you can see, Bernie has been fighting for us for a long, long time.